Ambassador Flynn says his statement is an ultimatum and that it holds law and other church supervisors responsible for making sure that this never happens again. Cardinal Law issued a statement today responding to the Pope's letter, and in it, Cardinal Law writes that he is most grateful to the Holy Father for the sensitive and helpful way that he addresses the situation. In Boston, Carol McKenzie, NECN.
Now, what did the Pope's comments mean for Catholics in the Church?
We'll ask our guest tonight. Ray Flynn is the former Vatican ambassador. He is also the national president of the Catholic Alliance. And Father Edward Vacek is a professor of moral theology at the Westin Jesuit School of Theology. Thanks to both of you for joining us tonight.
To be here.
Father, let me ask you about your reaction to the Pope's comments. Did they go far enough? Some Catholics, some victims are saying they wanted more.
Well, first you have to understand that this document is not explicitly on pedophilia. That's the first thing, and I think it'd be to read too quickly that it is about pedophilia. It's a long document of about 8 pages. It's mostly on the sacrament of reconciliation, penance, confession, and near the end there's a little passage that's very different in tone than the rest of the document, in which, as we just heard, there's a statement that some of our brother priests have not fulfilled their vows, and therefore people are referring to that. But it could be a one shoe fits all kind of a, if the shoe fits,
sure,
go ahead and wear
it. He
it.
never uses the word pedophilia, for instance, or America, or says that this is the problem to which he's referring.
There's one little clue in there, perhaps, and that is as he uses the word victim, and he talks about compassion for the victim. And I think that would easily apply to the situation here in the United States and to victimhood. But somebody in India who had just been victimized by a priest who ran off with all the money would also be able to read this document and say that applies to me.
Ray, I heard your comments. It seems like you read a little more into this than there was. I mean, it was one rather brief paragraph in a lengthy document.
I guess I place a lot of importance on the messages that are communicated from the Holy Father to the world community. And it takes a lot of time to prepare for it, and every word is scrutinized by the Vatican. They don't idly make statements about an issue unless they are going to deal with it in a very compelling way. I interpret it, Chet, as somebody who's literally read every word that's ever been printed with this man coming out of the Vatican. I interpret it not as a suggestion or a mere formality just to fill up a couple of pages here. I interpreted it as an ultimatum to the hierarchy of the Church in the United States, if not across the world. Not suggestions, an ultimatum that they want to put these changes and these reforms in place. I'll bet you if Cardinal Law were here and Cardinal Egan were here, and they told you asked this question, they would sincerely say this is a serious message by Pope John Paul II.
But to a layperson, he wasn't specific about any reforms or anything.
No.
I mean, he lamented and expressed pain over the priests who were accused of abuse, but he laid out no formal reform.
They never would. They never would. The Vatican never would. He never would. But I think what it is, it's a call, you know, basically to use our vernacular, you know, shape up or ship out. That's how I interpret it. And quite frankly, Marjorie and Chet, I spoke to a number of Vatican officials the last 2 days who put me on alert that such a statement was going to be issued, and they are taking it in the most serious and compelling way.
So how will this be carried out now? How do they step forward with it?
I think I also, maybe Chet is right, maybe I'm reading too much into this. But what I think this is not a piecemeal approach to the problem of pedophilia in the priesthood. I think what it is they want a universal, or they want a state policy, so there's a consistent policy, one protecting children, so pedophile priests will never again be assigned to a parish. And the second one I read into this is that they want cooperation with law enforcement officials. The Pope talked about evil in that statement, didn't he? I think what he's saying is this is a sin, but I think also that he's opening the door to treat this as a crime, and that's a big step forward.
Sure. Father Vacek, is this also an attempt to sort of protect some of the other priests who have been tainted by this? Afterwards, they didn't answer a whole lot of questions, but they did say that they quoted a new study that said that 3% of American priests had a tendency to abuse, and 0.3% were pedophiles, those who had any sort of sexual contact with children under 13. And also trying to say that's a small percentage.
Again, I'm not sure that all that's in there, that in the document is all that you find there, but you probably have better resources than I, and surely the things that you're arguing for, Ambassador, are important, and the kinds of things that are going on. I think there is in that little paragraph a statement of a plea that all priests should not be tarnished with the same brush, a plea that there are a lot of good priests, and that those same priests, like myself, are agonizing and feeling great shame over this matter, and are feeling, as many priests that I know, afraid of their own parishioners and afraid of what people might be thinking.
Do you think this sort of statement helps them?
I hope it does. I think a lot more needs to happen, a lot more healing needs to happen, and so this will only be a small part in that kind of healing.
Father, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say it's very difficult to be a priest in these times.
Indeed, we can all recognize that. And have you, I know this only came out this afternoon, but have you had an opportunity to discuss it with some of your brother priests?
Sorry, I just received it this afternoon and I just read it. I've discussed with them the kinds of conflicts that are going on in their own lives. The document is very, very warm. It starts off with a kind of passion. It starts off with, oh, we've got to be personal to people. It even talks in language that's just jarring in their own beauty. He says we should be warm. We should hug people like a father. We should be tender to them. And I'm thinking all along, oh, not in Boston, not in Boston.
Can you imagine the conversation we'd be having right now, Father, if there were no mention of this crisis in the Catholic Church about sexual abuse of priests? Would say, why didn't the Holy Father at least mention it? This would have been a great opportunity, because this message on the eve of Easter is a message to communicate to all the priests of the world. I think he went as far as was necessary to send a very clear, compelling message.
Well, maybe this wasn't the forum to do anything more specific. You've got to wonder how much more specific could he have been. I mean, I don't think anybody expected him to refer to the situation in Boston.
I think some people did.
Yeah, they
perhaps
did.
There were some people today who voiced that concern.
Yeah. And it's a valid point on their part too. I mean, they want a clear resolution on the part of the Catholic Church. I think that it's not the way the Vatican operates. Quite frankly, if the Vatican didn't communicate this message, I would be not surprised, and although I would be a bit disappointed. But so what he did was, I think it's, not only is it big news and it's being treated as big news, but I think it's a significant message that he's communicating to the leadership of the Catholic Church.
Well, in light of that, some people say that suspicious by its absence was any sort of support of cardinal law whatsoever, or some of the cardinals who are dealing with this, and specifically.
Well, I would say that if I were the cardinal, I'd be pretty happy that he wasn't mentioned in there, because of the fact that if he had been mentioned in there, and it were mentioned in a negative way, it would have been a very different conversation we're having right now.
And tragically, he's not the only one. I mean, there's so many he couldn't single out. I mean, even in his own native country, a friend of his in Poland was, you know, one of the priests.
I think we have to put this in the category of very important, very compelling statements. In fact, I think all Catholics should embrace this message as a positive step in bringing about the changes and reforms that are necessary.
Okay, well, we'll find out what one Catholic thinks about it in just a moment. We'll talk with a person who belongs to a victims' rights group. Just a minute.
In his annual letter to priests, Pope John Paul II mentioned the alleged sex abuse victims of Catholic priests. He said the Church shows her concern for the victims and strives to respond in truth and justice to each of these painful situations. We're joined now by Phil Saviano from SNAP, the survivor network of those abused by priests. Phil, welcome.
Good evening.
You had an opportunity to hear the first part of the discussion.
Yeah.
Let's hear your take on what the Pope had to say today.
Well, with all due respect, Mayor Flynn, I feel like maybe you and I read different documents, because when I read the Pope's remarks, I didn't see a single measure of reform, a single explanation of why we have this problem, or a single suggestion of what the Church can do in the future to address it. And I think that's what Catholics, and particularly abuse survivors, are looking for, is some sort of leadership out of Rome, perhaps a national policy that all the bishops would abide from. If not national, then international, because certainly this is a problem not only in the States but in Europe and in Australia as well. One of the problems is that the way the church is set up, each bishop is autonomous, each bishop reports only to Rome, and it's left to each bishop to come up with his own way of handling this problem. Some bishops have done better than others, but if there was a national policy with specific guidelines, for example, any priest who's reported would be removed from an assignment pending an investigation, that the investigation would be done, for example, by civil authorities instead of fellow priests, because it's the police, actually, that are trained to investigate criminal matters. That victims would not be forced to sign gag orders in order to get reimbursement for therapy, for example.
Phil, do you think these are some of the things that could be forthcoming from the church, and maybe this wasn't the forum, that the Holy Father wanted to sort of lay this out and then go from there? I mean, he called it a great evil. And
it is an evil, but he also called it a sin, and I think there's been way too emphasis on the aspect of this being sinful as opposed to criminal matters. And this is also not the first time the Pope has addressed this issue. First time that I'm aware of goes back to 1993, when at that point he thought that the problem was caused by the permissiveness of the national media in the United States. I think that it's been a problem long enough. There's certainly been time to address it, and it's something that we really need.
What about that, Mr. Ambassador? He's had ample time. This has been a building problem.
Well, here we are. We're discussing this, and every national media outlet here, if not across the world, certainly in the United States, is commenting on the Holy Father's statement today. It's being delivered to every priest in the world. There will be discussions, I assume, in most of the parishes, and like we're discussing it here. Maybe you don't understand how the Vatican operates. They don't submit a blueprint, a detailed blueprint of how how business should be conducted. The Holy Father will speak in terms that send a clear universal message. It's like his ultimatum on war and peace. He doesn't say, you know, we ought to send troops here in Bosnia when we ought to put 7 tanks here.
Go ahead.
Mr. Flynn, this is a problem that is costing the church millions and millions of dollars. It's destroying the lives of so many children.
The church doesn't have any money.
Somebody has to be in charge. And it's the Pope and his associates in the Vatican who have to take responsibility for this.
I think he did today, and I think the church has been taking responsibility.
There's been way too much apologizing, way too much praying about this issue. We need more than that.
Well, I think that's what's happening. I think these reforms are in place. The Cardinal appointed a blue ribbon commission. I talked to the district attorney today. She is thoroughly convinced, the district attorney of Middlesex County. She publicly stated that these reforms are going to be implemented, suggested to the Archdiocese of Boston, and I think they're going to be reforms that are going to be implemented.
I'm thrilled to hear that somebody from the DA's office is on that committee, personally. I think it's perfect.
Okay.
Let me bring Father Vacek into the conversation. You mentioned, Phil, that and Ambassador, that this is being discussed here tonight in virtually every media outlet in the world. Is it being discussed? Can you imagine, have any priests, to your knowledge, discussed it from the pulpit or brought up the subject in sermons since this story hit the headlines?
Oh, it's been
yeah.
everywhere, and that's part of the embarrassment, but part of the cleansing process. It's taken place in Los Angeles. I know I've talked to people who have been in Minneapolis, who have heard sermons in Omaha, Nebraska, who have heard sermons in Chicago. Everybody is talking about it. No sooner do I get on the telephone talking to people than they can communicate to me that they just heard a homily or a sermon on this particular topic. So it's quite widespread.
And ever since this has happened in Boston and this has all come to light, other priests have been resigning or been taken out of the pulpit in various different cities in the United States. Does there need to be a blanket policy? Does the American church, if not anything from the Vatican, need to say this is how you handle these situations and this is how we proceed to cleanse ourselves from here?
I think so. I would support a policy that would, number one, would state that all substantial allegations of sexual abuse against the priest ought to be reported to appropriate law enforcement authorities. It shouldn't just be considered a sin within the church, but it also now ought to be a civic matter. I would support that, and I hope the church universally, the church at least in the United States, implements that.
So who needs to develop those rules? Where does this need to come from?
The U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference would have to implement that.
Phil, would you grant that at least the statement today in the Pope's letter was was a first step, and that perhaps it wasn't the forum to lay out a specific plan of action for reforms that need to be put into place.
Well, it was a first step, but it's not really any different from anything he said in years gone by. And I think that at this point we're in such a crisis here that he needs to do more.
It seems to me, though, that what you could see in this statement, and again, I don't think it's strictly about pedophilia, but what you can see in this statement is a further impetus to the people in the United States to do what we're already doing. And one of the things you have to understand about the church is that the church tries to not just be General Motors with somebody on top and everybody else's minions, but each bishop has a certain autonomy and authority, and has from the beginning of time.
But don't the rules come from the top?
Nope. Depends. Some rules do and some rules don't. The church is not that kind of an organization. It has always been organized around its individual bishops, and now the bishops collectively in the United States. And the Pope is precisely the Pope because he's the Bishop of Rome.
So do you see action then amongst the U.S. Conference of Bishops? Is there a coming together? Is there sort of a clarion call going out and saying we need to do something and do it very soon?
I think it's inevitable, and I think it's happening, and I think every diocese is, the next time they get together, I would expect that they'll...
Isn't the autonomy limited?
Phil's perhaps saying, why are they waiting till the next time they get together, whenever that is?
We can have the same meeting, we can look back and talk about what a wonderful policy they've come up with. Then. Is that what your prediction would be?
What I would be saying is that the policy would be in place, but I think the conversation that is going on would already have changed matters considerably. So that there's a different milieu, there's a different atmosphere. This is now clearly a problem that the church has to face in a way that once upon a time it could be put under the rug, if you will, and it was wrongly put under the rug. It could no longer happen anymore.
Father, if the bishops enjoy, I mean, certainly their autonomy is limited. You can't imagine, can you, any bishop calling for a re-examination or an end to celibacy?
Bishops have done so. They can do that, of course.
So the American Church could do that? That could actually enact that without the approval of Vatican?
Not enact, but
well, they can call for it.
Call for it,
okay.
Yes. And the bishops of late have, especially in the United States, have been unwilling to break ranks. But it's quite within their capacity to do so. And within their own diocese, each one can make a different kind, not a different rule for the whole church, but can raise different questions and even in some areas make different kinds of rules.
Phil, you look dubious.
I can't imagine that any bishop in the United States could decide on his own that in his diocese he's going to let his priest get married and get away with it. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that. That's part of the universal discipline. But he could raise the question.
Well, he could raise the question, but nothing's going to come of it.
And if enough bishops raise questions, things could happen.
And if enough parishioners stop dropping money in the basket every Sunday,
that would mean less poor people get services. That's what that would mean.
It would mean the victims would get less.
Yeah.
So would be unable to.
The people that I represented as mayor of Boston, when the church was always there to help the poor and the needy and people living with AIDS and homeless people, that the church is the major provider of these services for. That would mean, insofar as government's not doing
it. Phil, you get a quick wrap up.
We're about to
almost out of time. We're quickly out of time and get a quick wrap up.
No, just. A quick wrap-up is first of all, I'm glad that we're doing this program because the only way to put a stop to this is to get the issue out on the table. Victims need to come forward, reporters need to report on it, church officials need to start talking about it. And in that sense, we're making progress.
Okay. Father?
And I think there's a changed milieu, a changed atmosphere, and it's all for the better. There's a certain airing of dirty laundry that's now getting cleaner, but still we've got a ways to go.
Okay. Thank you all so much for being with us tonight. Our guests, Ray Flynn, Father Ed Vacek, and Phil Saviano.
Next, if someone told you that you were being sued, but the case wouldn't be heard for years, would you be upset?
This is one of the problems in the Massachusetts courts, a crisis in the judiciary when NewsNight continues.